reflected in the cities today, that approximately 30 to 40 miles or so in between at the end of a day's travel. Now, there were also along the Via Egnatia supply stations with blacksmiths, even veterinarians, can you imagine, and other services along the way. Now, how many miles apart do you think these would be placed? Now, the inns were placed at the end of the day's journey. According to Procopius, there were around 5 to 8 of these per day's journey. And that makes sense. You don't want to have a gas station at the end of the day. You want to have gas stations and so on, and not to mention other things, to stop and get, some Hershey's Kisses or Swedish fish along the way. These were placed along the way, 5 to 8 stations where people can get services done, whatever they might be. Now, travel on the Via Egnatia was done, of course, on foot or with horses or mules or wagons or carriages and chariots or so on. And here's a relief of a little carriage. And by the way, can you see there? He's holding the rein with his right hand and the whip with his left hand. We'll come back to that, put a Post-it note on that. Because notice this next slide, the travel was done, it moved from the left, like this. Why? Well, notice he's whipping with his left hand. So travel moving to the left had it moving from the left. Now, transport on the Via Egnatia was primarily, during the Republican era, was primarily for governmental things. So, for example, mostly silver and gold and so on being transported on the Via Egnatia. So the road was for the transport of the military, also for transport for the government, for things. And by the way, there were even weigh stations to weigh the wagons and so on, to weigh the loads on the Via Egnatia. Now, non-military, you maybe might be thinking, what about non-military individuals? Well, non-military government officials or government couriers who used the Via Egnatia were required to carry passports. Well, not this one in particular. Couldn't find a picture of an ancient passport. They were most likely just letters that they were carried. But non-military government officials and couriers, they were required to carry passports. Now, another question that might come up, you may be wondering, well, would it be possible for a non-military person, a common traveler, would it be possible for a common traveler to acquire a passport? It would have been very, very difficult, actually. The governors were allotted only so many passports to give out at their discretion. So it wouldn't have been very likely for a traveler to get one of these. So during the Republican period, when Rome was in a semi-perpetual state of war, well, common travelers and transporters, they were forced to use secondary or parallel roads, which begs the question, well, then how could Paul have traveled on the Via Egnatia? What do you think? Well, what about Sergius Paulus? He was the governor of Cyprus. I wonder if he provided Paul with a travel permit. Well, but he wasn't the governor of Macedonia. Also, we're going to see in a moment, it wasn't Paul's intention to even come here. So he wouldn't have thought ahead of time, hey, would you, on his way through. How else might he have gotten? Well, he was a citizen. Well, yeah, but still, you're not a governmental worker. Well, what about the fact that he was a tradesman? Well, but it wasn't for the government. So how was Paul able to travel on the Via Egnatia? Well, this is something of not an introduction, maybe an introduction to some, but probably not to most of you. But this is an example of when you're doing research on these types of things, we're looking at particular eras and points in history where things were in effect. So for example, last fall, when we were on the Via Egnatia, our guide, who actually was an archaeologist, brought this up, that common travelers could not travel on the Via Egnatia. Well, the thing, and I guess this shows even archaeologists can make mistakes, the thing is, she was speaking of the Republican period. During the Pax Romana, things changed for the Via Egnatia in terms of organization. During the Pax Romana, after Rome conquered Illyricum, made Mysia a province and Thrace, and after they established relative peace in Macedonia, the military movement shifted to a more northerly route, bypassing the Via Egnatia. So although during the time of Paul, the Via Egnatia continued to serve the empire's needs, the road during this period became, by and large, a communal artery of commerce, culture, communication, ideas, travel, and even hiking. Now here's a stretch of the Via Egnatia. I wonder if Dr. Hersey could arrange for our students in the course to have these little donkeys to carry our luggage across. Well, this is a modern picture, but in fact, during the Pax Romana, common people did trek this road. Well, speaking of Paul, the most famous person to travel on the Via Egnatia was not a Roman, but a Jew, Paul. And Paul first encounters this road on his second journey. And let's trace this journey. Where does it begin, his second missionary journey? Well, it begins in Antioch, where Paul and Silas launch, and they revisit the churches in Galatia that they had planted on their first missionary journey. And then, like Paul, the adventurer, he says, well, let's just keep going. And they aim towards going to Asia, that great Roman province. While they're there, let's just keep going. But we read in the book of Acts, the Holy Spirit forbade them. So they says, well, let's go north towards Bithynia. But then we read again in the book of Acts that the Spirit of Jesus forbade them. So they move westward and they come to Troas, right on the coast, now having gone all the way across the continent here. Now you'd think at this point they'd catch a boat, return to Antioch, but in the evening, at night, Paul has a vision of a man from Macedonia saying, come here and help us. So the next day, Paul and Silas, and do you know who else? They picked up Timothy, and they picked up Luke, and the four of them launch across the Aegean, spend a night on the shore of Samothrace, and they continue, and they land at the port of Neapolis as they're on their way to Philippi. And here's a picture of the modern city, Kavala, which is ancient Neapolis. And by the way, in the Life and Times of Paul course in the field study, this is where we begin. We begin the story of Paul in Greece, where he actually sets foot on the continent of Europe. Well, from Neapolis, here is the Via Egnatia, and you can see Neapolis in the distance. So Paul and the three, they go from the port, and they now step onto the Via Egnatia on their way to Philippi. And this is what we did last fall. Here's some students. I'm actually surprised to see Mitch back there at the pack. There's a bunch of others out ahead. It looks like they're lost in conversation, which again doesn't surprise me that Mitch would be there. He's just great with questions and discussion and so on. But at any rate, notice here that this is the beginning point of this particular stretch. By the way, much of the Via Egnatia no longer exists or is buried. But here's a stretch that still does exist. And you can see it begins right there in the neighborhood of modern-day Kavala, Neapolis. And we continued on it. And there again, you see Kavala in the distance. We're coming towards us, towards you. Here's a picture taken by one of the students. Notice the, remember the curbs I mentioned that kept the stones in place? Here's where we stopped. There's Shelley sitting over there and others. This is where we stopped, and it's at this point that the guide mentioned this troublesome little detail that common travelers could not have traveled this road. It was a military road. So we're beginning to discuss that here. We pause and discuss right on the very Via Egnatia, we're talking about it. This was a highlight. But we continued, and there we are now concluding our walk on this particular stretch. It's not quite a mile, pretty even, this slight incline as we go. It trails off, and then we hopped on a bus, and then we picked it up again in the ancient ruins of Philippi. Now you see a road there, a modern road, and just paralleling this in the forum, you'll see the Via Egnatia, but this is you can see this is how the Via Egnatia came through the ancient city of Philippi, right in the middle there, right adjacent to the forum. There it is. You can see these stones. You can even see traces of the wheel marks. Actually, you can see here, this portion, you can see what this was guttered. I didn't mention it, but some of the stretches of the Via Egnatia, especially in the cities, would have gutters. And notice also a sharp eye would notice a column up there. It would seem that the Via Egnatia, as it came through the city, was colonnaded. And by the way, this was the decumanus for the street. The Via Egnatia becomes a decumanus for the city. And here is the students. And there's a good picture of a chariot wheel or wagon wheel that etched its way into the stone over the years. And there are the students. Oh, there's an excited student, Monty, pointing at the Via Egnatia. Isn't it interesting, the things that excite us, things that we never even heard of, a week ago or a month ago. But what a joy, discovery. Well, as you know the story, after spending a few days in Philippi, on Shabbat, Paul and the team go outside the city walls, and it's at a riverbank that they meet some women, God-fearers, praying. And we have our first converts of Paul on the continent of Europe, Lydia, the entrepreneur, and her family, receiving Paul's good news, and whole family baptized, and she invites them into her home, and great fruit as Paul comes on the Via Egnatia into the Greco-Roman world. Well, unfortunately, it wasn't long after, just a few days later, Paul gets arrested, and he's dragged back into the city. And we think probably in this area here, in the western end of the forum, these are perhaps the likely locations or possible locations where Paul was arrested and beaten. We read about that in Acts chapter 16. Well, he eventually leaves the city after, again, being brutally beaten. And he then goes to Thessaloniki. And in Thessaloniki, like Philippi, Paul's message of Christ as Lord and Savior is received. enthusiastically, but at the same time, he experiences again hostility and threats on his life from local mobs. Now, at this point, think about it, Paul, again, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but if not, I think you might, but if not, if you look at the Via Egnatia coming through, he's come to Neapolis and Philippi, to Thessaloniki. You would think, and a question is often asked, I wonder why Paul at this point, as he's leaving Thessaloniki, why doesn't he just keep going west and catch a boat across the Adriatic to Brindisi and take the Via Appia to Rome? Why doesn't Paul just keep going west? I mean, we know he kept going west when he was in Anatolia. Why doesn't Paul at this point, having preached in Macedonia, in the major cities, why doesn't he just keep moving westward? Does anybody know why he didn't? In fact, perhaps why he couldn't have? Well, in Acts chapter 16, Luke records it was at this time, a little bit earlier, Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. So Paul wouldn't have been able to go west to Rome because about a year earlier, the emperor had expelled all the Jews from Rome. And Paul would have met people on the road saying, Paul, go back. You can't go into Rome. Well, what about at least traveling west on the Via Egnatia? If not all the way to Rome, well, he could have at least gone to Pella or Edessa and preached there. Why go off to Berea? Why doesn't Paul at least hit those other major cities? Why Berea? Well, the answer is found, as is typically in biblical studies when we're thinking of questions like this. The answer is found in context and also in geography. First of all, what was the context here? Well, Acts 17. In Thessaloniki, the townspeople in an uproar, the mob, saying, these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. So the context is one of hostility and threats against Paul's life. And then geographically, what do we know? Well, if you notice this map, notice the city of, or the village of Berea is actually off the Via Egnatia. Cicero calls Berea an out-of-the-way town. So contextually, Paul's life is at risk. Geographically, I think at this point, it wouldn't have been safe for him to be traveling along a main thoroughfare like the Via Egnatia. So this likely explains verse 10. So the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. So that probably explains, this is an example of how there were times when Paul was on the Via Egnatia, and there are other times strategically where I think it might be wise to depart from the Via Egnatia. Well, a few years later, however, during Paul's third journey, he returned to the Via Egnatia when he revisits the churches in Macedonia during his third journey. And there's evidence, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but there's evidence that not only did Paul travel again on the Via Egnatia, but there's evidence that Paul made it all the way to the westernmost point of the Via Egnatia in Dyrrachium. Why do we think this? Romans 15:19, where Paul writes, from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ. Remember I mentioned earlier that the Via Egnatia went through the provinces of Illyricum, Macedonia, and Thrace. Well, where is Dyrrachium? Dyrrachium was in the southern end of Illyricum. So scholars think that purple line Scholars think that when Paul came into Macedonia during his third journey, we know he went from Macedonia to Corinth. It may have been at this time that he makes it to Illyricum, as he mentioned he did in Romans, which was written later. So it's likely, perhaps, that Paul, after going to these cities in Macedonia, he continues west, goes to Dyrrachium, and then down to Corinth, and then back up and over and back to Jerusalem. Well, coming back full circle to our mile marker. Those industrial workers who uncovered this milestone way beneath the sand that's now on display at the Archaeological Museum of Thessaloniki, which we visit, they were likely unaware of the significance of this mile marker. But they discovered a milestone to an ancient highway that connected Rome to its eastern provinces and beyond. But these workers, they unearthed more than a milestone that connected Rome to the east. They discovered a mile marker of a road that extended the reach of the gospel of Christ from the east into the west through Paul. And that's quite cool. Well, if I can, at this point, the presentation concludes. Thank you for listening, and God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. V, for that wonderful presentation on the Via Egnatia and how the historical geography behind it all and the context of it can inform a bit of our understanding of some of the words in Acts and Paul's life and journeys. So it's great. If you enjoyed that presentation, we're very grateful. Dr. V's with us right now, so we're glad that he can join us for some Q&A. If you have some questions, some follow-up, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Our team's filtering those. Thank you to those of you who've already entered it in. It's amazing to me to see where everybody is from. I was making some notes about all the different locations. We have the Ivory Coast represented, North Carolina, Michigan, Illinois, Texas, California, Alberta, Canada, New York, United Kingdom, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Missouri, Germany, Haiti, Texas. I said Texas already, but Texas you can say twice, I think. It's just, it's such a big state. Ontario, Canada. We even had Mark Wilson. I think you referenced him in your presentation, Dr. V. He's joining us from Antalya, so that's exciting. Ecuador, Nova Scotia, Uganda, and even Apollonia. I'm mispronouncing that, so just please forgive me. It's very exciting to see all the different parts of the world that people have tuned in from, and I'm sure there's others as well. If I didn't see him on the message bar, please forgive me. Dr. V is going to be teaching an online class this semester titled The Life and Times of Paul. If you've enjoyed this presentation and our time with him, we hope you'll register or consider registering it. You can audit the course or take it for credit if you're trying to work towards a degree, either with JUC or another institution. There'll be 2 information meetings with Dr. V held on the dates. I think they're here. You can see them there. And if you want to get to those meetings, you could take your camera out on your phone and on your screen, take a picture there of that QR code, and it should get you right there to register for those meetings. They'll be on Zoom. They will be live with Dr. V, just a chance to get to know a bit more of the logistics, a chance for you to ask questions about the program and the trip to Greece that will be in December. Hope you'll check that out. And then additionally, we will have a list of bibliography available after this presentation, and it'll be available on the website. I'd love now to move to our questions. Some people had asked about a recording. Absolutely, this has been recorded, and we can't wait to share it with you in a follow-up email. So feel free to keep your eyes open for that and enjoy it as it comes. The the questions, and I think Dr. V, you're with us. Can you join?
Oh, hi.
How are you?
Good
To see you.
I'm glad. I'm great.
Yeah, you're great.
Wow.
Right there.
Until I heard that Mark Wilson's out there.
That's always the best when you're giving a presentation and there's the experts out there that are checking everything on you. It's good. I hope that it's always nice to have quality folk tuning in. Not that everybody's quality, but just the people who've spent a lifetime studying this and have really dedicated a lot of time to writing and publishing for our benefit. Yeah. So let's take some questions here. I'm going to go ahead and send one out to you on our that we received here. And some of these are the same, so if I don't give your name, please forgive me. But I'm going to give this name. This is from Roberta. What were the conditions, Chris, of the Roman roads in Israel, and particularly the road to Emmaus? And I know you've spent time in Israel. You've spent time in Jerusalem with us. Can you talk at all to your familiarity with that? And I know it's a little bit out of your purview, perhaps, of study, but we'll start with that one, a complicated one right away.
Well, actually, it is out of my ballpark there. Again, to punt to Mark Wilson, he covers roads in the life of Paul and the New Testament in Greece, in Italy, in the land, Asia, and so on. So I'd encourage you to look there. I'm not really expert at all in that area. So I'd have to punt on that one. I was with Paul Wright and some students some years ago, and we sat on what was considered to be perhaps the road to Emmaus. We're not sure. But as to road markers in the hills of Judea, I'm not
there's only, to my knowledge, the road to Emmaus is pretty badly preserved now because of all of the construction that continues to happen in the west part of Jerusalem. And we actually took our students on a hike there this past spring on a deliriously hot day. We did hit mile marker, I think it was 14 or 12. It's still there. But when I saw your image of the mile marker, it brought that memory back. Let me ask you one that's going to be more in tune with your presentation. But why are there two ports of origin to the Via Egnatia on the Adriatic coast? You have Dyrrhachium and Apollonia. And I'm probably saying that wrong, so you can correct me. And which is the most common port of entry based on your study and understanding?
Jonathan, can you tee up the slide of? Here we go. Cool.
Wow, he's right on it. Well done, Jonathan.
Yeah, wow. If you look here, this is like the classic map of the Via Egnatia that appears out there. One little tweak I would suggest is if you look way to the left, you see Dyrrhachium and Apollonia, and they have the road from Apollonia to the Via Egnatia in green, as though it were a secondary course or connected road. Well, actually, it wouldn't be considered that. It was part of the Egnatia. Now, in terms of why are there two entry points or points of origin on the road, if you look at Brindisi, you can go virtually straight across the narrow there, land at Apollonia, and there's some evidence that may have been the original entry point. But Dyrrhachium, that's the longer route, but it had a larger harbor. It had a more sheltered harbor. It was more conducive for landing large armies. Also, Wallbank, who's one of the experts on the Via Egnatia, he also points out that if you landed in Apollonia, you'd have to cross two major rivers to get to the main section. So because Dyrrhachium was larger, more well-protected, more conducive, in fact, it was the major port of merchandise exchange across the continents there. That's probably why that became the central entry point.
Okay, so they enter. Okay, you have the ship. They're dropping off let's say they're dropping off a contingency of soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
Reed asks, how did Romans prepare for a 30-mile travel day? what is involved in that process?
Well, marching, and there's different statistics on how far they can go per day. Horseback, they can go pretty quickly, but a whole marching contingent or legion would go slower. There were on the Via Egnatia, there were, as I mentioned, there were stop points, there were garrisons along the way, outposts along the way. And in the Republican period, when things were still, for example, Cicero mentions that the road was just infested with Thracians. And there was a lot of turbulence, and so you had a lot of military outposts along the way, especially at high points or sharp bends or mountainous areas. So there were places where they could stop, be refreshed. There were places where they could trade horses and so on. And of course, there was, you didn't bring this up, but because of the military posts along the way, the road was well protected as well.
That was another question I had, is how did, and maybe there's more to flesh out here, speak more to how Romans maintained these roads, both from a physical standpoint as well as a security standpoint, over such long distances. I mean, I think of like road repair crews, and I've done the highway, construction crews. How do they manage all that?
Yeah, well, the locals it was primarily built by the military. Locals were involved, though, somewhat, and they were involved in repair work of the road. However, with Trajan, you begin to return the upkeep of the road to the military. And in fact, I mentioned the mile markers in the imperial era. Most of them, mile markers, are from that era. You see repairs done by Rome. So your major repair work was done by Rome. And Trajan did a lot of it, not only there, but throughout, especially with this war against the Parthians.
So I think this relates to a question Gene asks, what type of stone, is there a uniform type of stone being used? Is it really contingent on your environment that you're in, the geology that's around you?
When you mentioned there's going to be a reading list at the end, and I think I have in here an article. I hope I do. If I don't, I'll make sure it's posted. But yeah, it is listed. Varaguli and Sidakis, they talk about this, and one of the things they point out is that the stones were taken locally, so they weren't importing stones. They were using the stones that were local to the area. There's granite, there's marble, cobblestones. You can see in the picture cobblestones used. And then in Philippi, you see larger square stones. But yeah, they were local. So you're not like, having to bring in boatloads or truckloads, cargo of stones.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the Emmaus Road, just to use something earlier, and in my huntings around in my spare time of West Jerusalem, it's all limestone, because that's what we have available to us. The Cenomanian limestone is all around, and the remnants of whatever road was there seem to have been fabricated by the local stone.
Yeah, and I might want to mention too that the part of the road that the students walked on in my class, those cobblestones, some of them were like 8 to 11 inches thick. They're not just small little cobblestones, they're thick, and some were even more so. And we found it kind of difficult to walk on, actually.
I find that even walking through Jerusalem, my feet hurt more than if I'm walking through, a concrete jungle of the United States somewhere. It's very different, and there is something to the stone that can kind of be abrasive to the walking, which, and talk about the nature of the footwear perhaps that people are walking with. I mean, they're not walking with the nice, soft, cloud-like hookah shoes now that they have.
No, I mean, they're certainly not walking barefoot. The soldiers here, they were well fitted. I'm more of, again, my focus here in my studies has been more on the road than the footwear. But I mean, it had to have been sturdy, leather, well padded. I believe Carl Laney has done some things. I think I saw him out there. He's treated this in his book on Paul and other things. And I think he has an article also in the Lexham Geographic Commentary on that. But I found it, we'll put it this way. I would think for them, it was very smooth walking compared to us walking on it. You know, we would look at this as a very difficult road. They would look at it as a very smooth paved road, because in comparison, you just have dirt roads and soft roads and mud and areas that were prone to flooding, swamps. So they really moved swiftly along these. So that's all to say that they could maneuver well and quickly in a way that maybe we can't.
So you have these people arriving at the ports. You have this major east-west corridor artery that's connecting people and ideas and thoughts. I'm curious if you can speak to the ways perhaps that the Via Egnatia served as a corridor or a conduit for cultural and ideological exchanges between perhaps east and west.
Exactly.
I would love to hear you speak to that.
It's a great question. It's an excellent question. And something, again, to emphasize, and I think this is a good thing for all of us in whatever field we're studying. We have to look at what particular time period are we looking at? And when we're looking at the Republic period, as I think I mentioned, the primary transport was governmental. It was a military road. It was transporting armies and military to protect the province from the tribal attacks in the east and other places in the north. So in the Republican period, it was a military road, an official road, and transporting silver and so on. Now, in the Pax Romana, in the imperial period, when now where the army, as I mentioned, is now bypassing the Via Egnatia, the armies are now moved up north. Wallbank, for example, and others point out at this time, now the road is opened up to travel, tourism, culture, exchange. And there's an article here I put in the bibliography by Yanis Lolos. And this is a great article that he talks about the exchange of culture. Not only cultural goods, but the exchange of thoughts. It was absolutely instrumental and significant, and in the way that the Via Egnatia was a conduit of exchanging thoughts and culture. He does a really good job in even looking at what particular commodities and things were grown or sold in particular cities along the way, and so on. You also had pilgrims walking across and all sorts of that. But again, if you look at your bibliography, now he has a whole book on this, but it's in Greek. But his little article, Yanis Lolos, I think it's wonderful. After giving a brief introduction to the road historically, he moves into that imperial period where it ceases to be primarily a military road, and now it becomes an artery of cultural exchange. By the way, speaking of books, this is a fun one. This looks like an old crusty book you find in a library. In fact, it is The Ignatian Way by Furman O'Sullivan. This book was written in the early 70s, before that milestone was discovered. But this is a great, great read. Now, you have to update it, of course, with current monographs and articles and so on. But earlier today, I was looking at this, and I came across a really interesting little note he says here. At the time he wrote this, they didn't know who Egnatia was. In fact, the name means fiery. And we know that it was called the Ignatian Way. We have that in Strabo and Polybius. Maybe it was a fiery road. They didn't know who it was. And he has a little quote here. He says, if we could just find a milestone with the name, we could fully identify this mysterious Ignatius. So thankfully we have updated material, but if you're interested in reading more on this, it's a very fun read. And he traces it, by the way, all the way from the beginning of the path, all the way to Byzantium. Other questions?
Yeah, I have another question about the way stations. You mentioned the way stations. I love the relief you showed us with an image of a way station or an outpost, whatever we want to define it as or call it. How frequently are those dispersed along the road? And maybe you said it and I missed it.
Yeah, I did.
Archaeological.
The supply supply stations, according to Procopius, were positioned every 7 to 14 Roman miles.
Okay.
The supply stations between 6 to 12 miles. You got to stop for gas.
Yeah.
Got to stop, pick up some Swedish fish or whatever.
You must have ridden with my kids.
Yeah. And now there was a number. So on a day's journey, you would hit a few of these. Okay. Now the inns though were placed 30 to 40 miles apart. The inns, basically at the end of a well-traveled journey. And in fact, to this day, some of the major cities there, you see this reflected in the distances between the cities today up in northern Greece.
And do we know how big those inns would have been? How many people could perhaps lodge? Do we have any way to estimate that or understanding of it?
I'm sure there are ways. The little picture, the little relief I showed there, you can see the little guy looking out the window.
Yeah.
Again, I think in terms of military, you'd have outposts, you'd have camps. But these, what you're looking at are couriers, Roman couriers, and mail carriers traipsing along the road. In the later period, when now you have travelers staying along, now it's a good question, where did Paul stay?
Sure.
We know he stayed with Lydia, probably connections where he maybe stayed at a home, but I would think that he would perhaps stay at an inn. Though in the cities, we see him staying like at, Gaius is his host, or they're even like synagogue hostels that would have been friendly towards him. Paul was making friends along the way, making connections.
Yeah.
And I think of, for example, like when he meets Lydia, perhaps Lydia provided them with horses. Who knows? Perhaps Lydia called out ahead and says, "Hey, here's a place where you can stay along the way."
I imagine those inns were spaces of the changing of ideas as well. So as we see ideas moving from east to west along the corridor, I imagine these served as organic locations of conversation.
Absolutely. And by the way, I think that when we read about Paul, when he comes into Philippi, he doesn't go immediately to the river. We see him, Luke mentions that Paul stays a few days in the city of Philippi. And later, when Lydia is converted and she invites them into her home, I bet they really enjoyed that, as opposed to these inns and other places that they were staying.
Sounds lovely. I think I would have been. We both would have enjoyed it, Chris.
Yeah.
If we were on that journey, it makes me the image you showed of the innkeeper. The immediate, probably because the sermon this past Sunday at our church was about the Good Samaritan, and I think about the road from Jericho to Jerusalem and the inn that the person stayed at. I'd never really thought about the actual inn itself. So it was neat to see that image because it just kind of put things in a bit of context for me and maybe visually helped me think about that space. Let me ask you this question that Kelly asks. Kelly Keating, I'm going to change topics a little bit, shift the gears about the passports. You talked about the passports. Why did governors limit the number of passports issued? What do you think? Was there a limit to using it, perhaps to preserve the integrity of the roads, et cetera?
Well, they were only issued a certain amount yeah, absolutely. In fact, we have evidence where, you had your what do you call these stations where you'd exchange horses? I just lost the word there. Relay places to. There were even laws according to how many horses you could have, how many horses could be rented out at these stations in terms of the traffic. Cicero makes a comment. Cicero was exiled around AD 57, 58, somewhere in there. And he spent about a year in Macedonia. And he mentions at one point that he couldn't even travel on the road because it was so crowded.
Wow.
So it was, and this is during the Republican period. And again, you have military and all sorts. And then he mentions the Thracians infesting the road. So yeah, there was definitely limits placed on how many could travel. And that would then reflect on how many permits the governor would have to give.
And then as I'm going to combine two questions here, Lynn Jacobson and then Alice Brannigan, and I apologize if I mispronounce any of your names, but they both ask similar questions. Lynn asks, was weather or seasons a factor in traveling on the road? Do we see more traffic perhaps in the springtime or the summertime versus the winter? And then Alice asks another question I think is related. What dangers, in addition to the weather, might one need to be cognizant of as they are making their way across the channel, the corridor?
Well, again, in terms of the period, during the Republican period, when you had these marauding tribes, and in fact, there's discussion, why was this road even built? Well, it was built to protect the province. And I believe it was Cicero who said a province is measured by how far the spear could travel. In other words, the province is even beyond the province because of the invaders. So during the Republican period, there would have been danger for sure on the road from and this is why you have the military there. In the imperial period, about 27 BC and on, during when things were more peaceful, Macedonia became a relatively peaceful area. Romans also, Thrace is now a province. They expanded further east. And so you have, during the imperial period, this is why, again, the Roman army is moving up north.
Yeah.
And so now in terms of weather, it's interesting. I didn't mention this. I was thinking, after I finished, I thought, I wonder if I should have mentioned this too. But, there were other Christians that walked this road, and one of them was Epaphroditus. In Philippians. We read that Paul, writing from Rome in prison, the Philippians sent Epaphroditus to him with a gift, and we read that he got sick. And there's some thought, and this is addressing the question, that he may have traveled during the winter. And it would have been cold up there. So the road was very stable. I mean, it needed repair work. And in fact, at some points, it got very rubble in a lot of areas. But primarily, it was built firmly. They avoided swampy areas. The Romans, it wasn't about the straightest way to get there, the quickest way. It was the way that was in terms of geography and the land. So it was a pretty stable, safe road. And but again, this is a Roman province, and people would have been relatively safe during the Augustan period and following. Of course, there's always, I live here in Chicago, and you never know.
Well, and you probably get a feel for what areas perhaps are, you want to avoid. I mean, going back to the road from Jericho to Jerusalem, that was traditionally understood to be a road that was prone for no good things to happen in a pretty barren landscape where your sources of help were far and few between. Let me ask a different question. This is a question that Maurice Vellicott asked. And he asks, would the knowledge of a synagogue in Berea be another reason perhaps that Paul is going to go there from Thessaloniki? And Paul seems to have had a desire towards the ethnic Jewish brethren to engage them in hospitality, and it could be perhaps that's also dictating his travel. Can you speak to that a little bit? And I'm sure you might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, and conversely, this is why we don't see Paul stopping in Amphipolis or Apollonia. Probably no synagogues there, but yeah, he had to have been aware that there was a synagogue in Berea. So he, maybe it served two purposes: getting off the road to avoid those who we know are after him, the posses. But also he goes there as opposed to another place off the road. There were other places off the road he could have gone. But he goes there, I think, certainly to, not only was he off the beaten track, was he off the main highway, but he also is going to a place where there was a synagogue.
A synagogue, yeah.
Thank God. And by the way, speaking of the Life and Times of Paul class, any of you who have been to Berea, it's interesting to me that the guides, they always, and again, those of you who have been here, you know what I'm talking about. They take you to what's called the Bema of Paul. There's a really beautiful icon, I believe I showed it here, of Paul getting his Macedonian call and then coming to Berea. And it's interesting, the tours always bring you there, right? Those of you who have visited, that's where they bring you. But how many of you actually were brought to the synagogue, the old synagogue in Berea? And I find now that that's where I go first. And if I never go to the other one, but yeah, it is very tender. In fact, you look there and you notice you're outside the walls. Right behind the synagogue is a little river. And it was absolutely that Paul, he targeted to the Jew first.
Yeah.
It was.
Off topic question from what we were just chatting about, but I want to touch on this because Elaine Cromhout, again, I apologize if I've mispronounced your name. The itinerary as resource fascinates. Can you tell us a bit more about its provenance and origin and purpose? And so maybe you could speak to that a little bit in terms of the itinerary as resource. And I think I'm looking at a consternation on your face. I think what we're getting after is the itineraries that perhaps travel logs. When I hear itinerary, that's what I think. So travel logs.
Yeah.
How can those, where do we get access? I mean, I know from ancient Egyptian sources that we have great military travel logs from the pharaohs. And I have a feeling that's what's in view here.
Yes. Yeah. That is a very, very good question. I love that question because it's kind of like, well, what are these? You know, I've never noticed this before. These itineraries, and again, in terms of bibliography, I tried to anticipate questions and that you might have, or those who want to go into further reading on this. In the bibliography, there's a little booklet. There's a small booklet by Satsapulu Kaludi on the Via Egnatia, and she has pages and pages of some of these itineraries, and she parses out what they depict or designate. So basically, the itineraries, their purpose was to show distance, to show, first of all, to show where the inns were, to show where the places were, the stations, the rest stations and inns, and then the distance between them. So now they're kind of kooky. They don't, when you look at them, like you have Greece here and Africa right here, and they're not really proportionately similar to what we would be thinking of our maps. But primarily they're you can see you see city names in them, and then you see distances. And then the roads and other geographical things as well, like water and so on. They're almost like remember the old days, the AAA, road map?
Yeah.
That's exactly what they were.
That's a good analogy. That makes sense. I have one last question, and want to be sensitive to everybody's time. We'll wrap it up. But one last question. Besides Paul, do you think there were any other early Christians that maybe utilized Via Egnatia, the road? I know that we're conjuring, but maybe we're conjecturing, but maybe there's some textual evidence that you're aware of that would allude to that in your thoughts and research.
Well, I mentioned Epaphroditus. When we think about it, from Philippi, and traditionally, we think Paul would have been imprisoned in Rome, so he would have traveled the Via Egnatia all the way across, caught a boat across the Adriatic, got on the Appian Way up to Rome. It would have been about 730 miles there. Another one is in 1 Peter, Peter likely writing from Rome to the Christians in Pontus and other places, and perhaps Silvanus, who was his courier, is taking the letter of Peter, and he would have come down the Appian Way, crossed the Adriatic, got on the Via Egnatia, went all the way over to Byzantium, and then he would have caught a ship up to Pontus. So Silvanus going that way. So not only are we is the gospel going this way, you have letters going that way, you have service. So here is Epaphroditus bringing a gift of service. So you have the gospel, edification, doctrine, theology, and service to others. But there's another one, and this goes into church history. Ignatius of Antioch, when in Syria, if you can imagine this, when he's arrested, soldiers escort him across modern-day Turkey. They come to Troas, catch a ship, and we read that Ignatius then comes to Philippi. And then from Philippi, he was escorted by soldiers to Rome, where he was martyred. So you have Christian martyrs on this road. When Jonathan asked me, actually, I think through you, Oliver, your kind invitation to have me speak today, to pick a topic, I mentioned earlier how I like roads, but the other thing is, one of the earliest names of the Christians, we were called the Way. And those of you who know a little bit of Greek know that the word in Greek for way is the same word for road. But either way, no pun intended, we are, there's something about us that there's something about movement. We're all about movement. We're going somewhere. We're on a road. We're on a way. And I just love the Via Egnatia and really getting into this, because it basically, it highlights again that we are part of a narrative. At Wheaton College, I'd ask Christians or students, are you a Christian? And they say, yes, I believe that, ... No, it's not just that I'm a Christian, I believe this. But yeah, I'm a Christian, let me tell you a story. We're part of a story. And studying the Via Egnatia and these roads where all sorts of things went on, not just Paul, but others. It's a real lesson, a significant lesson in Christianity.
It's amazing to think about how the road systems that existed become the very conduits to the advancement of the kingdom, the way of the kingdom, and that's been true even before the Greek and Roman roads had been instituted or fabricated. It existed when God brought his people to the crossroads of the ancient world here in the land as well. And so it's neat to see how God uses these geographical places and this infrastructure for the advancement and the conversations that ensue in the way stations or along the journey or at the synagogue in the local town that you stop in, to see how all of that gets advanced. So Chris, well stated there at the end. Thank you for sharing these thoughts.